I'm Jim and I was retired. I've been considering what kind of cash equivalents I should use in my DIY retirement. And by the way, I was retired is the name of this channel because that's how this DIY retirement started. I was retired and I'm still retired 8 years now. So follow along for a DIY take on where to stash cash for 5 years. Nominals, tips, or IBonds. Stay tuned. Now, in the past 2 years, I've been moving from bond funds and ETFs into holding individual bonds, especially treasuries. And as a reminder, in my retirement portfolio, I keep about 3 years of expenses in cash and equivalents in bucket one, and another 5 years of expenses in income producing assets in bucket two. And in bucket three, I hold all other assets, which I can let grow for later years in retirement. Most of that is in equity. But back in bucket one, I have cash in the bank and treasury bills and CDs in my IRA and brokerage accounts. So in this video, I'm going to look at the options of where to park cash as part of my fixed income in bucket two. So we're going to look at nominals or Treasury notes as long as 7 years. And I'm also going to look at 5-year TIPS or Treasury inflation protected securities. And I'll look at IBonds, which are really 30-year savings bonds, but are ideal for cash that you need in 5 years from now because that's when the penalty goes away for the 3 months of interest. Now, David Enna, who writes the TIPSwatch, has detailed reviews on these three options, including some direct comparisons of IBonds versus TIPS and TIPS versus nominals. And I'll put a link to his website and some others that I found in preparing for this video in the notes below. And remember, I keep a record of all the links I've shared on my Google sites. So if you ever want to go back and do your own due diligence, you could take a look at those resources. Hey, before I go any further, please like and subscribe to this channel and hit that bell. If you like entertaining ideas from a DIY retiree, the more likes and subscriptions this channel gets, the easier it will be for other DIY retirees to find it. So let's begin with the options that I'm looking at. Treasury marketable securities come in three basic flavors. Bills are short-term loans issued by Treasury in terms of 1 year or less. Now, T-bills are usually purchased for something less than the par value, and then they pay their interest when they mature and you get the par value. While you could resell a T-bill on the secondary market, you might not recoup the full price you paid for it. So it's usually held to maturity. Any interest that you earn on a T-bill is ordinary income for the federal taxes, but exempt from state and local taxes, with a caveat there that if you hold the T-bills in an IRA, you're taxed like an IRA only on the withdrawals from the IRA. Now, usually T-bills earn less than their longer government securities like notes and bonds, but you may have heard of something called the inverted yield curve in the past few years. T-bills have been paying higher annualized rates than notes. But the question is, for how long? When will that yield curve revert to norm? So I've been rolling over some of my T-bills into 2, 3, 5, and 7-year notes. Now there are 10-year notes, but that's getting into the time frame of my bucket 3 assets. And so in this video, I'm not going to look at the 10-year notes or that third flavor of treasuries, the 20 and 30-year bonds. Now, unlike T-bills, notes and bonds pay a coupon interest rate every 6 months until maturity. If you want to resell them on the secondary market or buy them there, you will find them listed with your brokerage fixed income offerings. Now, all treasuries are generally available at auction as well, either through your broker or the Treasury Direct Gov website. Now, here's an example of a 5-year Treasury note that I purchased last August in my IRA. The trade confirmation from Schwab shows the price I paid, the principal, as well as the announced yield to maturity and the coupon rate for this note. Here's a bar chart that I developed quickly just to show you the expected cash flows from this 5-year note. This bond had a coupon rate of 4.375%, and it paid its first interest in February 2024. So I expect about $875 annually for the next 5 years. And when it matures in August 2028, I'll get that $20,000 principal back. And I will have earned $4,375 in interest by that time. Now, but the interest is not compounded into the principal. It's paid out as cash twice a year back into the IRA's cash fund. What will $20,000 be worth in 2028? Well, just looking at a simple inflation calculator, it'll have a future value of about $17,677. So how good a return is this note? So I put together a little spreadsheet to validate the published yield to maturity. And it begins in the upper left of this spreadsheet with the settle date, the maturity date, the annual coupon rate, the price I paid per $100, which was a little less than the par value of $100. There are 2 payments a year for 5 years. And the yield formula gives you a yield to maturity of 4.4%, just what Treasury said it would be. Then I used the rate formula to validate that. I used the starting principal, the par values, the coupon payments, and the total interest to calculate a rate of return. And yep, that's 4.4% too. But I got thinking the note returns not only that coupon interest, there's also a slight gain between what I paid for it and par. And when you look at that and add that to the interest and then put it into your original principal, it's and the return on investment calculation, it's only about 4.06%. Now on the right, I tried another way. I tried to use the XIRR for internal rate of return from his cash flows. And there, the return showed a 4.44%. And that's better. And then I looked at FINRA's method of calculating total return on a bond. And when you use that formula, it's 4.42%. Now that's better than the ROI calculation. And closer to the yield to maturity calculation. But then you got to consider the average inflation rate over the next 5 years might be like 2.5%. And if you use the Fisher formula to look for a real return, it's only 1.88%. Inflation takes a bite. Notes have some advantages. The pros are that you can buy your notes through a broker or Treasury Direct. There's a secondary market to buy and sell after an auction of the note through your broker. If you buy it in Treasury Direct, you have to move it to your broker to sell it. There's generally higher interest compared to TIPS and IBonds on notes. It is taxable in a taxable account, but it's tax deferred if you're holding it in your IRA. Now, the disadvantages are there's no inflation protection. Selling before maturity could result in a loss of principal. It will depend on the market price when you go to sell it, plus any trading costs through your broker. Now, here's an example of a 5-year TIPS that I purchased last October, again in my IRA. And this trade confirmation from Schwab shows the price I paid, the principal, plus some accrued interest. TIPS are a little complicated like that. You suddenly get hit by a little charge for accrued interest. There's the announced yield to maturity and the coupon rate for this TIPS. Take a look at that coupon rate though. It's 2.375%, and that's far less than the nominal that I showed you earlier from August. But the yield to maturity of 2.44% is different here. It's in effect the real rate of return, since the coupon interest will be paid on a principal that adjusts every 6 months with inflation. So I took a look at the bar chart cash flows from this TIPS that I could expect. And I expect to generate about $475 for the next 5 years in coupon interest. And I'm approximating the adjustments that I'll see in principal each year. Now, note that the interest paid twice a year is not reinvested. It goes into the cash portion of the IRA. And when this tip matures in 2028, I'll either get that adjusted principal or the original principal, whichever is larger. During deflation, the principal can actually go down if the TIPS is held to maturity, but you will at least get your original principal back. Now, this chart reflects a hypothetical 2.5% inflation annually, and that would result in about $22,076 in adjusted principal at maturity. That plus the coupon interest of $2,375 would mean a return of $24,451 for a TIPS. My little spreadsheet that I used on the nominal bond does help validate that the published yield to maturity works for a TIPS too. It comes out with the same answer. But in the case of TIPS, the yield to maturity is the real yield. And all the rest of the calculations on this page don't work. If you want to track the performance of your TIPS, I suggest IBonds.info. That's EYEBONDS.info. And this website, I'm not sure exactly who does it, but it scrapes Treasury for all the information on TIPS and sorts them so that you can get the information about the one that you purchased. And it includes everything, including the initial yield to maturity. But keep in mind that your principal will be adjusted by that non-seasonally adjusted consumer price index. And in fact, each reading sets off a period of a whole new set of index ratios for your TIPS for each day. So if you did want to sell it, you'd know what you're selling. You need to keep in mind that those changes in principal are also taxable. Now, if you hold a TIPS in a taxable account, you'll pay tax on both the coupon interest income and the changes in OID, or original issue discount. And that actually could create some phantom income before you even get rid of the bond, either through maturity or selling it. If you hold to maturity in an IRA, all these problems disappear. You'll just be taxed on ordinary income for the withdrawals from the IRA, and it's much simpler. Now, TIPS have some advantages. One is better inflation protection with the adjustments to principal from the CPI readings. Second is you can purchase them through your broker or Treasury Direct. There is a secondary market to buy or sell them, just like notes, after auction through your broker. But the cons are there's a complicated formula with these index ratios. Selling before maturity could result in a loss of principal depending upon the market price. And taxable interest and changes in OID in a taxable account will hit you every year, but tax deferred in an IRA account. Keep in mind, when you buy an individual TIPS, you've already locked in your yield to maturity, your real yield. And you're just going to have to ignore the red that you're likely to see on fluctuating market values. Hold it to maturity. Now, using my IBond calculator, I also calculated the cash flows for $20,000 in IBonds through December 2029. Now, that's longer than the 5-year nominal or 5-year TIPS that we've discussed. And at that point, interest would no longer be subject to the 3-month interest penalty for withdrawal or partial redemption. Now, wait a minute. I thought you couldn't purchase more than $10,000 a year, and we're going to buy $20,000? Yes, that reflects one bond for each of us in a married couple. If you need more, on IBonds, please see my playlist here. Now, I'm using an inflation factor of the known inflation factors that we know for the bond in April. And then after that, I'm using an inflation factor of 1.23% for all the future 6-month periods. Now, that's actually a little less than the 1.26% that's averaged over the life of IBonds. Now, again, this is purely conjecture, but by December 2029, this IBond could grow to $25,016 in value with those assumptions, and that would surpass the TIPS. There are some pros and cons of IBonds too. The first pro is the tax deferral of ordinary income until redemption. If you hold it in a taxable account, and it is a taxable account, you're still not taxed year by year. You're only taxed once you redeem, either partial redemption or full redemption. There's semi-annual compounding. That plus the fixed rate and the inflation factors adds up to real inflation protection. Now, full or partial redemptions after 1 year, and there's a modest 3-month interest penalty through year 4, and then there's no interest penalty after 5 years. So this is really a easy to understand product. The cons are you can't purchase it inside your tax deferred account. You must use taxable dollars to purchase your IBond, and you can only purchase it through Treasury Direct. You can't go through your broker. You can't sell it to anybody else on a secondary market. You can only redeem it through Treasury Direct. The annual purchase limits of $10,000 per tax ID. So for a married couple, that's 2 individuals, plus $5,000 on the tax return as a paper IBond, but I've not done that. But you can also use gift strategies or purchase for a business or trust that might have its own tax ID. So again, look at my playlist on IBonds for more. IBonds and TIPS are meant to protect against inflation. And how real is that problem? Well, I based this experiment on an average 2.5% inflation, but I really have no idea. This is a chart from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, their FRED database, and it reports the 5-year forward inflation expectation rate of 2.38%. Now, this is a measure that's calculated by comparing the 10-year and 5-year nominals and TIPS to show you what inflation might be in a 5-year period that begins 5 years from today. So could inflation fall to 2.38%? Maybe. Fred also shows you the 5-year break-even inflation rate by comparing the current 5-year TIPS to its nominal counterpart. If inflation runs higher than the break-even, then TIPS work out better than nominals. So if it does come in at 2.5%, I come out ahead with a TIPS. If it does go back to 2% or lower, then nominals will have outperformed TIPS. The truth is, we won't know until 2028 for sure. By the way, the University of Michigan's survey of consumers reports the median price increase expectations for 5 years ahead is about 3%. And in the March Federal Open Market Committee meeting, they issued their latest summary of economic projections, and that showed that policymakers think that the longer run inflation measured as personal consumption expenditures will get to 2%, but not until after 2026. And also keep in mind that personal consumption expenditures, the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, generally runs about 50 to 75 basis points below the more popular consumer price index. So while they are aiming for 2%, we're more likely to see 2.5% on the CPIU measure. So what is my preference for nominals, tips, or IBonds? In fact, I'm using a bit of all three. I use tips and nominals in my IRA, and I can do so because I can defer any income tax on the interest until I withdraw from the IRA. And as we showed you, it certainly makes holding tips easier in an IRA than a taxable account. Because IBonds can only be purchased in taxable accounts, albeit tax deferred until redemption, I buy these with taxable accounts, bank or brokerage, whenever it makes sense. For now, as I've shown in my recent video, the 1.3% fixed rate on an April IBond with about a 4.5% guaranteed for the first year, it's a good place to start parking money for emergencies. And I intend to keep it in my bucket too for the 5 years till it gets past those interest penalty that happen in years 1 through 4. I will conclude with my standard warning. I'm not a financial planner. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a tax preparer. I have no initials after my name. So take these as entertaining ideas from one educated consumer to another. Always do your own due diligence and seek out a professional if you need one. See ya.